Test, test. Good morning, Mr. Faris.
Hello, good morning.
We will start after we accept all the participants, sir.
Yes, hello.
Sagot niyo na hupay.
Okay, everyone, please open your camera because we will begin our session today. Good morning, Mr. Faris.
Hello, good morning.
Okay, everyone, please welcome our last speaker, Mr. Muhammad Faris Al Fadhat. And before we started, I will introduce our speaker today. Uh, He is Muhammad Faris Al Fadhat as a senior lecturer in the Department of International Relations and also Vice Rector of Student, Alumni, and AIK Affairs at Universitas Muhammadiyah Yogyakarta. His education background, Mr. Faris undergraduate from Universitas Muhammadiyah Yogyakarta, Indonesia, and he took his master program from Gajah Mada University, Indonesia, and continue his Ph.D. program from Murdoch University, Australia. And Dr. Faris is a senior lecturer of political economy and currently serves as a vice rector for Student and Alumni Affairs, Universitas Muhammadiyah Yogyakarta. He received his PhD in political and international studies from Murdoch University, Australia, and postdoctoral fellowship at the Department of Public Administration, Korea University. Previously has been a visiting scholar in the Graduate School of Global Studies, Tokyo University of Foreign Studies, the Japan Foundation, and the Asia Research Center, Murdoch University. His research interests revolve around international political economy issues, especially those related to regional economic governance, contentions East and Southeast Asia, and the role of corporate actors and capital transformation. His articles have appeared in such as Journal Contemporary Asia, Asia Affairs, East Asia, Australian Journal of International Affairs, Journal of Asia and African Studies, and Journal of Forest Economy. He is the author of The Rise of International Capital, Indonesian Conglomerates in ASEAN, which is published by Palgrave Macmillan. Okay, Mr. Faris, I will give you an hour to you to deliver the material, and then we will continue to the Q&A session.
Oh, thank you very much, Bagas. Would you mind to allow me to share screen, please?
Okay, sir.
All right. Okay, thank you very much. First of all, good morning, everyone. Very honored to have this kind of session. I hope we're going to enjoy our discussion for the next hour. Allow me to share my PowerPoint here. I would like to discuss about the political economy of Southeast Asia, particularly talking about the capitalism and economic transformation. I believe most of you are from Southeast Asia, so I believe are very familiar with what I'm going to discuss for this session. But allow me to explain in brief a couple of points that we'd like to address during this session. My background is in political economy, so the approach that I would like to discuss today is looking at the politics and economy, how the interaction between actors within this environment, whether in particular country like the Philippines, Thailand, Malaysia, Indonesia. So we are going to discuss the interaction between economy and politics and how this interaction shape the policy of our government. So let me start by telling you there are good news and bad news in Southeast Asia. All right, but let me talk about first what we are dealing as a good news. All right, there was a book that written by Steven Pinker. This is a very good book. So this book, it's discussing about the evolution of humankind through histories. So one of the point that Pink explained in this book is that humans are now living in the most peaceful era in the history of our species. And this is a very good news for our civilization, and particularly Southeast Asia. Why? Because through years, we've experienced, especially in the late 20th century, in the late 19th century and the beginning of 20th century, we've seen the numbers of conflict around the world. So if you see this chart, for example, this is the numbers of people or death that caused by war. So the number of death here in this chart is explained not causing by disease or any kind of environment, climate change, etc. But this is the numbers of people are dead per 100,000 caused by, first, whether civil conflicts with foreign state intervention, for example, in Middle East or in the Pacific Island. So there were other states that intervene into different countries and cause a conflict within that particular region. And the second, if you see the red color, it's civil conflicts without foreign state intervention. It means that people are conflict each other within different regions, between groups of people, extremism, violence, etc. So within, and we've seen this in many countries in Southeast Asia, not to mention Indonesia, Myanmar, and many other countries. So third, conflict, the purple color, conflict between states. It's like a war or etc. So, and the last, colonial or imperial conflicts. So if you see the chart here from 1946, all right, so the numbers are very, very high. And then this is the period of a Cold War, after the finish the Second World War and then start the Cold War. So we've known very well how the Cold War expanded into a war between Korean Peninsula and in Vietnam and many other countries in the Middle East. So, and then being reduced until 2020, it's a very, very low numbers of people or death cause of conflict, even though we're not saying that there will be no conflict or there were no conflict in the 20th century, but the number of people or deaths are being reduced a very, very few. So that's why, according to Stephen Vicker, we're living in a more peaceful era compared to the long history of civilization. So this is the news number one. So how about Southeast Asia, right? Southeast Asia is I think the only region that maintains a peaceful bilateral and multilateral cooperation through many, many years. All right. We've established our organization, ASEAN, in 1967, which coordinate the meetings, dialogue, and many other policy conferences, which make our region without any open war between each others. If you see any region in the world right now, from the Middle East, African continent, East Asia, even Latin America, there were tension and conflict between countries or between governments. Well, we are in Southeast Asia, we don't have that one. We are a most peaceful region on earth. Even, yes, we have conflict within our countries, but the conflict are not in terms of how one country try to invade or try to intervene other countries. So that's kind of organization values help our region to be one of the most peaceful region on earth. And that's helped later on how our economic development runs smoothly and increase gradually in a positive growth. That's why we've seen this picture. This is the picture of how ASEAN being most peaceful, political stable with no war in the region. So the second good news is that the global poverty has been reduced very, very significant through 60, 70 years or 7 decades. If you see here, in 1950s, over 75% of the world live in extreme poverty. This is just 80 years ago, right? So this is caused by war, caused by underdevelopment and many other problems that faced by many developing countries, even developed countries as well. But fast forward, 2010, less than 10% of the world live in extreme poverty. Extreme poverty, according to United Nations, live under $1 per day. Right? We've seen many people are in the middle income or low middle income, yes, but in terms of extreme poverty, the numbers have been reduced very significant. And it's projected for the next couple of years in 2030, less than 5%. Even though this prediction might be not 100% true, because we've seen the struggle of the world, many countries through COVID and the trade war between China and the US, it caused the slowing down of a global economy. It might be not successfully lesser than 5%, but around that number it's possible. So it means that we experience the decrease of global poverty, and that's a very, very good news for our human civilization. And Southeast Asia are doing extraordinary successful in this aspect, because ASEAN has experienced an economic prosperity since the establishment of the organization. Peaceful region help the economic growth, allows the government to maintain a policy that helps any countries in the region more prosper compared to any countries around the world, especially if we are talking about South region or developing countries. So yes, we've seen the growth of, first fact is that in the next couple of years, ASEAN markets will be number 3 in the world, after India and China as the number 1 and number 2. This is a very, very interesting, because many countries, especially the most developed economies in the world, wants to expand to Southeast Asia, wants to do cooperation, economic cooperation within the region, because our prospect of a large market, especially 2 countries, Indonesia and the Philippines. This is the 2 largest economy in Southeast Asia. And our GDP growth as well, since 2008 until 2017, the increase even total, the number of our GDP increased 50% after China and India. This is an extraordinary growth in terms of one particular region, because we don't have any single region that's prosper as Southeast Asia does right now. This is 5 countries, an example. If you see, look at the chart here, the growth of GDP in the last 20 years, 2 decades after the 1998 economic crisis. So you see here, the number of GDP growth significantly, especially in the 4 countries, Indonesia, Thailand, Singapore, Malaysia, and the Philippines. So it means that our prosperity is there. The number of people under the line of poverty are being reduced each year. So that's the good news for our region. Now, allow me to talk about Southeast Asia's bad news, right? So our good news is that we are in the most peaceful country, most peaceful region we've reduced the number of people under the line of poverty, and then we have a extraordinary economic stability and economic growth. And we're going to see that trend for the next 5 to 10 years. Our big market, number of young generation, and etc., that will help our region become the hub for global economy. All right. The bad news, some of the discussion I took from my chapter that I wrote in 2020. It's called the chapter I wrote entitled "The Internationalization of Capital and the Transformation of Statehood in Southeast Asia." I've provided the file if you want to read the file. Very happy to give to all of you. And first, I would like to talk about the Southeast Asia's economic development. We've really started our development since 1970s for most of countries, with the exception of Singapore, because Singapore has an early start. Before any other countries in the region, Singapore has started the early economic development. So our region experienced a rapid economic development since 1970s. Through especially selectively liberalization of national economies. It means that many our countries opened the policy of investment, try to engage with the global market, and networking with the region and transnational production network. So that's how the economy moved around the region. But first policy was adopted by many countries, including Indonesia, Philippines, Thailand, Malaysia, and many other countries. In 1970s, the countries applied the policy as called import substitution industrialization, which means that this is the early development of economy that countries or the government try to push for the domestic production. Many companies within these countries, the government tried to push for the birth or the consolidation of domestic companies in order to produce goods, produce any kind of products that can be consumed domestically, in order to substitute all stuff that most at the time being import. That's called import substitution industrialization. It helps the growing number of domestic companies at the time. And then in 1980s, when those companies being consolidated, they have a large number of production, and then the government switched the policy to export-oriented industrialization, or EOI. This policy helps those companies which already established to push more production, more stuff being produced, not only to sell at the domestic market, but to sell overseas through export. This is from domestic companies. It allows the emergence of new capitalist group, or big companies at the time become larger and larger and played a dominant role in our region economy. So companies in Indonesia, companies in the Philippines, in Malaysia, in Singapore, try to export as many as they can, their product, whether through regional markets or market outside of the region, like the European market, United States, and many other countries. This policy allows the consolidation of big companies in many countries. For example, in Indonesia, with Salim Group, the producer of the largest noodle company in Asia, Indomie, like Indofood, and many other products. Lipo Group, one of the largest property companies in Indonesia. Jarum Group owns the largest banking industry in Indonesia. And Malaysia, like Kuok Group, Hong Leong Group, Berjaya Corporation, which really controls the product. If we see them in supermarket in Malaysia, those are the product owned by or produced by large corporation or private conglomerates. And Singapore as well, exception for the Singapore doesn't really have a conglomerates like Indonesia and Malaysia, but really a government-linked companies which sponsored by the government, which really owns some of the share by the government. One of the largest is Singtel Temasek, which invests not only in Singapore, but many countries like in Indonesia, for example. It really invests a large share in telecommunication industry, especially telecom and Telkomsel. And Thailand, like Charan Pakan Central Group, this is one of the largest, among the largest conglomerates in Thailand. And we've seen this kind of trend as well in the Philippines. All right, the last stage, which are currently going, what we call as global production networks. It's a global and regional expansion of capital. It means that those companies which before in 1980s really focusing on exporting and inviting foreign direct investment and use that capital to export their product because a large number of production. Now they already in the third stage, how their capital, their product, their companies really expand to other countries through mergers, through acquisition, through investment. So those companies are really investing directly in other countries. One example is that one big companies owned by Indonesian conglomerates invested in the Philippines. Now the company owned the largest telecommunication company in the Philippines, PLDT. It's owned by Indonesian conglomerates. This is a good example how companies within countries really investing through different countries. That's what we call a internationalization of a capital or investment or business operation. Right. So especially in the last 2 decades, the important shift of Southeast Asian big companies, as I explained briefly in the previous slides, that's merges one of very important strategy for big companies acquisition and joint ventures. A report by the ASEAN Secretariat in 2014 shows that the increase of mergers, acquisition, and joint ventures that conducted by Southeast Asian companies or big companies really increased 12%, and that number outnumber what has done by the Japanese corporation. And it's really extraordinary because Southeast Asia, which less known by its large corporation, but now this kind of corporation already expanded to different countries. A number of companies in Malaysia and Singapore, for example, invested in many other countries like in the US, even in Africa, followed by companies in Indonesia. Now, some companies in Indonesia already invested and acquired many companies in Africa and in the closer one in China and in Australia. So this indicates the expansion of big companies and also signifies the role of state and political alliance of these big companies. So this chart shows the number of capital, number of investment that owns by big companies, which allow these companies to invest overseas. For example, I didn't put the number of Singapore here because the number of FDI, foreign direct investment stocks of Singaporean companies are far larger than any other companies. So that's why I just put Indonesia, Philippines, Thailand, Malaysia, and Vietnam. If you see that number, for the last 20 years, after the financial economic crisis, the number has been increased significantly. Indonesia reached being zero in 2000. FDI stock of companies in Indonesia are zero in 2000. Now more than 88 billion. Million. And then the most significant increase experienced by Thailand's companies, which also same experience in Indonesia, because in 1998, when the Asian crisis happened, it really started in Thailand and crushed the national economy and big companies at the time. But now look at the number, 155 million US dollars. So it's really increased significantly. I'll try to discuss 3 countries as an example, because I wrote in the chapter about Indonesia, Malaysia, and Singapore. Apologies, I didn't explain more about the Philippines, but the expansion of Indonesian companies, some of an example connected to what happened in the Philippines. So in Indonesia, big businesses were really consolidated. Consolidated means become larger and larger. For example, one holding company and then start having 20, 50 subsidiaries companies and become hundreds in 1980s. So one holding company now control more than 100 subsidiary companies. In 1980s, really consolidated and being expanded in 1980s. 3 ways of this consolidation. First, relying on government protection. Second, benefited from strategic sectors such as plantation, mining, and automotive industries. And third, focusing on controlling and protecting domestic market. First, how these big companies rely on government protection. An example of this, now, if you look at the phenomena in Indonesia, if you ask any Indonesian students, is there anyone who doesn't eat noodle? You'll get the answer no. Everyone eat noodle in Indonesia, especially instant noodle. And the most favorite brand is Indomie. So this is the largest, even the largest noodle companies in Asia, which export to more than 100 countries, even to Africa. One of my students in postgraduate studies here in our campus, when I show him the data that Indomie owned by Indonesian companies, he was shocked because he thought that Indomie was owned by African companies, because Indomie was so famous in Africa. And he thought that Indomie was an African noodle brand. And I said, no, that's an Indonesian brand, which export to hundreds of countries all over the world. And why this company became so large, so big, and so control the noodle industry? Because in 1960s, the government, or in the end of 1960s and the early 1970s, Indofood gained a government protection to the government by allowing only 2 companies to sell flour and noodle in Indonesia. The government didn't allow any other companies to sell this kind of product. Only 2 companies, first Indofood and the second state-owned companies. It means that the bigger of the companies become through the government protection. And the government helped, allow many companies to acquire a forestry in Kalimantan and in Riau to access the land. Second, benefited from strategic sectors such as plantation. So big companies in Indonesia at the time really relying on extraction national resources. Until today, mining, plantation, are still the favorite for big companies if they really wants to become a big companies in a short period of time. And the third is automobile companies and now telecommunication. The third, focusing on domestic markets. So in 1980s and 1970s, before the end of 1980s, many of these big companies are trying to protect domestic market. It means that they push the government to limit the number of other products to enter Indonesian market. Why? Because they really want to dominate the Indonesian market, because the large market of Indonesian at the time and until now. So we have now 270 plus million population, and that's helped really big companies to really dominating the market. Even though they try to export their product, but they try to push the government to help them in controlling in particular sector, especially plantation and agriculture. So these are the examples, like and I already mentioned before, like Jarum, Sinarmas, Gudang Garam, Salim Group, Wilmar, Lipo. These companies are really playing in the plantation, mining, automobile, and now like property, telecommunication. And in recent years, big companies, because of the 1998 crisis, they try to see that the market beyond Indonesia is really, really important for they help the companies become bigger. That's why some companies like Lipo try to expand to Vietnam. Wilmar own one of the largest plantation CPO in Kalimantan and Riau, and the company already moved to Singapore, not in Indonesia anymore. It allows this company to expand, to invest to overseas. So lastly, my note in here is that the state or the government has been crucial to support the expansion of conglomerates. So the bigger of the companies, it shows that the bigger role of political policies and government alliance. So they really help the government. One example how the closeness of big companies to the government, I'll show you in two examples. First, most of political campaign in Indonesia sponsored by big companies, even the presidential campaign. Now Indonesia will have soon in 2024 general election, presidential election. The Philippines already finished. Now we are going to see in Thailand who's the prime minister will be in Indonesia in 2024. So during the election, we've seen large numbers of finance from big corporations to support the governorial election, parliament election, and especially the presidential election. The example number two is that many of businesses appointed as ministries in Indonesian cabinet, Ministry of Trade, Ministry of Economy, Ministry of Investment. So many important posts in the executive government are really represented the big business communities. Okay, a second example is Singapore. So Singapore is exception because if you remember that import substitution policy, which applied by a number of countries like Indonesia, Philippines, Thailand, Malaysia in 1970s, were not the case for Singapore. So Singapore start right to export-oriented industrialization. even early on in 1960s. The reason is that because Singapore first has no large domestic market. Second, they don't have any natural resources. So they really start the export industrialization. So they push the companies which link to the government, owned by the government, try to produce a product, stuff, and export those products to a market beyond Singapore, and attract many foreign direct investment to invest in Singaporean companies, all located in Singapore. In 1961, so Economic Development Board, or EDB, was formed. The board have two rules. First, to attract more multinational corporations investment. So they try to invite us as many as they can, investment from many multilateral corporations, MNCs from the US, MNCs from European countries. And second, the government really support the government-linked companies, or GLCs. As I mentioned before, that in Singapore, the case was not the same compared to many other countries, where countries like Thailand, Philippines, Indonesia, they push for the private big companies, what we call as conglomerate, owned by family. It's private. But in Singapore, the big companies linked to the government sponsored or invested or owned directly by the government. So GLCs become the core of Singapore's conglomerate. They benefited from three ways. First, they partnership with MNCs. So they invite more foreign direct investment to help Singaporean companies. Second, spin-offs from defense industries. So they really benefited from defense industries, switching that. Third, privatize state monopolies and public utilities. So many facilities in Singapore right now, if you see, public facilities are run by private. Before that, many public facilities owned by the government, and cost the government to subsidize and provide a large amount of capital, large amount of government money to spend to that public facilities, and that causing more spending for the government. That's why they switched that to privatize the public utilities. And now if you go to public park in Singapore, you have to pay. Many facilities in Singapore are not free. Why? Because they are run by private companies. By 1990s, major GLCs had begun to venture overseas to expand, invest. Now, most of countries in Southeast Asia, most of countries in Southeast Asia having an investment from Singaporean companies. I believe no countries in Southeast Asia that don't have Singaporean investment. Particularly Indonesia, as the largest economy in the region, it's become obvious how Singapore invests. If you look at big companies in Indonesia, some of the share are owned by Singaporean companies. For example, telecommunication, as I mentioned briefly, telecommunication in Indonesia owned by government companies. These government companies own large share of the government link companies owned by Singtel. And one of the hot startup in Indonesia is Gojek. Gojek recently merged with Tokopedia, the largest online shopping. They become ventured together, become Goto. This is the holding company. Large share of Goto owns by Singaporean companies. So one example that Singapore really helped connecting the region, which in 1990s, there is a policy called growth triangle. This policy in 1990s, it really sponsored the cooperation between Singapore, Malaysia, and Indonesia, because the location of Singapore are close to Malaysia's Johor and Indonesia's Riau. Riau has many islands that we call now Rio Island. So they established triangle between three countries, and they established in a small island called Batam. Batam is now become a special economic growth for Indonesia, which actually started in 1990s as a proposal from Singapore to help Singapore economy. How it works at the time, Indonesia has a land and has a labor, and a very cheap labor. Malaysia also has a cheap labor at the time, but the land is limited. And Singapore doesn't have land. Singapore doesn't have land for locating big companies, and Singapore doesn't have a cheap labor. So the proposal is that to move the location of production to Batam, close to Singapore and close to Johor, companies from Singapore move to Batam, while Indonesian provide land and labor. Malaysia also provide labor, and they produce a very low cost of production and export their product with low price. So it helps the growing of economy and the growing investment from overseas to Singaporean companies. So it started the connecting between countries in terms of economic cooperation at that time. Now move to Malaysia. Malaysia is a unique because in some ways are related or similar to Indonesia, but there are differences, especially the tension between what we call a domestic ethnics, indigenous ethnics. They call Bumiputra, the Malay, with Indian Tamil and Chinese ethnics. So the expansion is rooted in the 1970s policy at the time. Why the policy is so important, what they call now N.IP, New Economic Policy, because through years before 1970s, Malaysian economy was dominated by the Chinese ethnics. Possibly around 85 to 90% of the national economy owned by ethnic of Chinese, because through hundreds of years, ethnic Chinese have been there in Malaysia because of the British colonization. And this inequality of economy caused the response from the Malay to anti the China, because they accuse Chinese in Malaysia really causing the problem. They're really eating all the economy and causing poverty to Malay. And that's why at the time there were riots, rally. People are going to the street and destroy many stores, many Chinese facilities, many Chinese stores, offices, and it's really huge at the time. And the government intervened that to stop the riot and to create the new policy led by UMNO, United Malay National Organization, to redistribute the wealth in order to make the wealth really distribute to the Malay. So new economic policies, it's really it's divestment of Western companies, joint venture between Malay and ethnic Chinese. So one of the result of this is that if the Chinese wants to establish a new companies, they have to cooperate, they have to join with the Malay. and allow the former state officials to provide to private business. So, for example, many Malay, when they retired from the government allows this retired official, government official, to held the position in a big companies in order to help the increase of Malay income at the time. That's why in the mid-1980s, under the Prime Minister of Mahathir Mohamad, the government facilitated the expansion of businesses, trying to push for more business that owns by Chinese, owns by Malay, to expand overseas. So they call vision to drive Malaysia as developed country in 2020, Malaysia Incorporation, which actually duplicate from the Japanese policy, because at the time Japan has a policy, Japan Incorporation. So Malaysian government under PM Mahathir Mohamad try to duplicate that policy in order to bring Malaysia into a developed countries. There are big companies now that own some share by the ethnic Malay, because of the switch policy that allowed the Malaysian businesses or ethnics to really own businesses, like Petronas, for example. Now Petronas, it's really, really big oil company. Why? I think one of the reasons why they really sponsored the Formula One, right? So if you see who's anyone here watching Formula One, the Mercedes team, Lewis Hamilton, sponsored by Petronas, because they try to expand more of the product to European market and the state. Malaysia also cooperate with the Korean Hyundai company to produce to help two companies, Perusahaan Otomobil Nasional or Proton, and then Pro2, Perusahaan Otomobil Kedua. Now Proton already expanded to different countries, including Indonesia. Yeah, if you look at cars in Jakarta, you see a few number of cars are produced by Proton. And Malaysia support the regional project ASEAN Free Trade Agreement in order to help the product to expand to different countries. So these are the case of 3 countries. So the next question, what are the impacts towards ASEAN politics and economy? First, the rise of populism and political participation. Populism is a hot topic in in politics nowadays. It's hard to explain in a short period of time, but try to explain in brief that populism really, many political leaders try to represent themselves as part of a population, as part of public, as part of large population, and try to associate them with all the people, that they are really the representative of the people. However, many political leaders use the populism politics in order to gain more power, which in the end not actually representing the people, but using that populist policies, populist issues in order to gain more power. And as a result of that the political participation of people are not really in a qualitative way. In a short explanation, it explains that people giving their vote without the awareness of the quality of the program, without the quality of the policies, but really because of the issues and because of the money that the elites provide for the population, provide for the voters. So that's the impact of how the role of big businesses in our government. We've seen this in Indonesia, we've seen this in the Philippines, we've seen this recent in Thailand even for the last 2 decades. This is, for example, the picture of one of the presidential candidate in 2019, Prabowo Subianto at the time. Now he's the Minister of Defense, but before that, he was the opponent of President Joko Widodo. So they use the issues of populism to divide people. And it's quite, I believe it's quite dangerous, because using the populism to divide people, to use the issues of religion, to use the issues of mass population in order to gain power, and causing the different between people to spectrum at a time, even within one particular family, father and wife, father and daughters, father and sons are split in terms of their political preference because of the populist politics at a time. We've seen this in the Philippines as well. The former President Rodrigo Duterte also using the issues of people, associate himself with the common issues, especially for to solve the drug trafficking, to solve the issues of the community at the time. Now, his daughter was elected as the vice president in the Philippines. So the issues of populism is causing a spread in many countries in Southeast Asia. In Thailand, for the last 20 years, since 2002, since Thaksin Shinawatra rose to power as a prime minister at the time, and then he's being dismissed by the military military government, and since then his influence still affecting the Thailand's politics even until today. Previously, his sister was prime minister for 2 years and then being dismissed by the military generals, and now one of his daughter elected as the member of parliament and owned the second largest political party in Thailand, owned the second largest vote in terms of parliament members. And now, because of the winner party did not elected as the prime minister, now it depends on the party of the Thaksin's daughter whether to propose herself to be nominated as prime minister or her counterpart in the party. So the second impact is that regional economic integration. So one of the impact that caused by the large role of conglomerates or big businesses, large businesses, tycoons, were actually driving the regional economic integration in the region. Now, if you look at the data, the trade between countries in ASEAN are larger compared to any other trade between the region to other countries. It means that the trade between Indonesia to Malaysia, Malaysia to Philippines, Philippines to Singapore, Singapore back to Indonesia are far more beneficial to countries in Southeast Asia because it helps the integration of economy. In 2016, we launched officially what we call as ASEAN Economic Community. It allows the single market of our economy, even though it's a process ongoing, but the commitment of our leaders to integrate our economy is really, really important. So this is an example of how economic integration in different regions, right? In Europe, we have European Union, the most successful one. ASEAN Economic Community is the second successful largest economic integration. We've seen this in North America, Middle East, South America, but the most successful after European Union is in Southeast Asia. And that's one particular role played by big businesses in order to push for more integration of the economy. And I think I'll stop in that. Thank you very much for the time. Would like to have a discussion, or later on I also have a quiz for everyone. So should we do the discussion question or should we do the quiz Bagas.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Faris. For now, we are going to have the Q&A session, and I will divide it into 2 sessions. Each session contains 3 questions. Okay, the first question from V. Oliveros. You can start now.
Good morning, everyone. Good morning, doctor. So, my question is the internationalization of the economy, such as foreign direct investment and trade between countries, and the expansion of domestic companies to multinational companies, proves that an indispensable economic driver in the region. In the case of Southeast Asia, with the establishment of ASEAN, the trade has become more accessible between countries, and there are several agreements, may it be multilateral or bilateral, and on how they regulate trade. That being said, this proves that the free market economy is no longer potent without government intervention. Singapore proves that the land area and natural resources is not a hindrance to prosper. Now, in the case of Philippines and Indonesia with a massive land area, should these countries still focus on agriculture, shift its priority to foreign investment? If then, how can we assure that this investment does not exploit the sovereignty of these states? Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Fee. It's a really, really good question. Should I answer right away, or should I hear another questions, Bagas?
I think sir, you can answer one by one question.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you very much once again to V for the very good question. So, if I'm not mistaken, you're asking about whether countries like Indonesia and the Philippines should really focusing on the agriculture, right? Because it's a large land of agriculture. Agriculture means could be, paddy field, could be plantation, anything related to the land. So if we see the fact that the 2 largest countries in Southeast Asia are these countries, Indonesia and the Philippines, and the land provides them with a large amount of resources. So if we ask whether should Indonesia still rely on this agriculture, no. In my opinion, the answer is yes and no. Yes, because it provides many companies, because now many companies are controlling the land, especially the productive land. Let me show you an example. So most of big companies, like 50 big companies in Indonesia, run business in plantation, because this is still the largest and the most profitable sector in the country. And the fact is that Indonesia produces more CPO than any countries in the world. And Indonesia's CPO are the best and with the lower cost. That's why the European countries, the European Union, tried to ban the product of CPO from Indonesia, accusing Indonesian companies are breaking the law, environmental law. So the companies are really trying to help growing their companies because of the providing of the land. So yes, the companies are really depend, and the number of contribution of this sector, it's quite substantial, whether in Indonesia or in the Philippines. But the second answer is no, because the trend for our global economy in the future is really not in the natural resources, because these natural resources will be affected by climate change, will be affected by the large number of extraction. For example, in Kalimantan, the decrease of forestry are increased every year. So it means that more forests are being destroyed by the extraction of companies. In the end, it will harm the land and many other particular aspects that will decrease the volume of the production in the next decade, for example. So if the government really rely on agriculture, my opinion, it will be the wrong policy, because we can see the example of Singapore. Singapore really focusing on on the technology, on the investment, and etc., and help. Even the country is very small country without any natural resource, and try to and already successful become the largest GDP per capita. Even though GDP total GDP are larger of Indonesia and Philippines, but GDP per capita still Singapore is the largest. Thank you. I think that's my answer. I hope it's explained some of your concern.
Yes, sir.
Okay, thank you. For the next question from Osid Ahmed.
Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
I have one question. As Mr. Faris has mentioned, that the government has a big role in that the government can play a big role in helping the domestic companies to enter the international law. Other than policies, what are the other roles that the government can play, but also keep the market as free as possible?
All right, thank you very much, Osid, for the question. So, what are the government's role except helping the government right away? All right. So the government's rule are still very, very strong. Possibly there are numbers of academics who will not agree with me that many academics possibly believe that because of the globalization, we don't need the rule of the government. Globalization allows for companies to trade between companies, cooperate between companies. But in my opinion, that's not entirely true, because in many negotiations, many bilateral and multilateral corporations, the rule, even though in the end, the companies will cooperate between companies, but the rule of the government are very important. One example is that when the trade war, I'll give you two examples. First, recently, because of the the hype of electricity car, yes, because of Elon Musk, Tesla, and etc., and the genius of the guy, and many countries try to ask Elon to invest to their own countries because of the trend of the electric car. So, but Indonesia has a very unique resource, because the largest nickel resource is Indonesia. All right. So Indonesia has the largest source of nickel compared to any other countries in the world. So they try to invest, try to ask Elon to come to Indonesia. The question is, should the company ask Elon? No, the government. So recently, the president of Indonesia, the ministries of Indonesia went to the US and asked Elon to sit together to discuss. So this is the role of the government in order to facilitate the big companies, because many nickel resources in Indonesia are really owned by big companies already. And the second example is that in terms of Vietnam, when the US and China war happened in 2018, so there were issues at the time. The big companies of the US big companies tried to move out from China because of the trade war. So the question is, among Southeast Asian leaders, where those companies will be located, whether to Malaysia, whether to Singapore, whether to Indonesia. Many countries are wonder, and they try to invite. So Vietnam lobbied the US government to relocate their companies to Vietnam. That's why at the time, the Indonesian government also lobbied at the time, but Indonesian government didn't receive any relocation at all from like 30 companies that move out from China. Vietnam, number of companies, and Malaysia, 1 or 2 companies are relocated to Malaysia. So it shows that the government really important in trying to facilitate multilateral trade, investment, and especially the cooperation. Yes, I still believe that the government would like to play a very significant role in terms of facilitating the expansion of big companies. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Faris. For the next question from Hervey.
Hello, good morning. Sir Al
Morning,
Fadhat,
Harvey.
I have a question for you. I am confused as to what is the bad news for Southeast Asia again with
All right.
regards to their to things in Southeast
All
Asia.
right.
I could think of 2. It could
Yes.
be the local conflicts between within the countries, like in Malaysia, there's a conflicts between Malays and the Chinese. I think in Indonesia, there's also the same conflict with the Chinese and Indonesians as well. Please correct if I'm wrong. And maybe the populism that you mentioned earlier, where the power of one politicians would use their power to, instead of improving the people, they would lift up themselves. They would use it for their own good, right? But
Yes.
despite the populist argument when it comes to bad news, countries like Singapore and I think to an extent Indonesia have really good economies. I think way better than the Philippines when like around 1970s to 1980s. Maybe that's our fault as well as to why we aren't as good. But back to my question, what are the bad news for Southeast Asia? That's all.
Well, thank you. Harvey, did I mention your name correctly? Harvey?
Yes.
Okay. It's thank you, Harvey, for the question. Yes, I didn't put the point 1, 2, 3 bad news. I tried to make a generalization, and this is my argument. Could be disagreed by many other lecturers or scholars, but in my opinion, the bad news for Southeast Asia is the 2 big role of big companies. They're really powerful now. And this actually contradicts with the idea of neoliberalization, that free market is actually allow the government to regulate the market and to allow big companies to compete each other. But in reality, in Southeast Asia, big companies or conglomerates not only doing business, but they are doing politics. And that's bad news. Why? Because they really intervenes the policy too much. Yes, the economy nationally will grow, like Indonesia, Philippines. Now, there are 3 countries that having the most outstanding economic growth. Philippines, number 1, Vietnam, and Indonesia. In 2023, these 3 countries are really outstanding in terms of economic growth, but are really representing the prosperity to all the people? I don't think so, because large benefits of this economic growth will benefit to big companies because they really influence the policy. They're really shaping the policy. For example, in Indonesia, like 30 to 40% of the ministers are from businessmen, and they really shape the regulation, the policy, the constitution, which allow them to benefit themselves. And the second bad news is that because they have too big role, too powerful in politics, and they influence the issues, the populist politics. So the funding of political campaign, how they control the media, and how they sweep the issues for their interest, for example. And that's, in my opinion, that's bad news, because we don't have the quality of voting, the quality of participation. There's a book wrote by Gary Rodden, one of my lecturer in Australia, that he argued that in Southeast Asia, there are participation. People give their political vote. They participate in politics. But the question is that are they really participating because of the quality of the democracy? He didn't think so, because it influenced by how much money provided by the candidate. It's common for countries like in Malaysia and Indonesia that the candidates provide a large amount of money to their voters. Even there is a book called Buying Voters in Indonesia, right? So it's a small village, people try to receive, even if they have like 3 or 4 candidates, 4 candidates provide them with the amount of money, and they took all of that. So that's, in my opinion, among the bad news for Southeast Asia. Thank you. I hope it's explaining what's your concern. Yes.
May I follow up with another question?
Sure. Yeah.
Okay. I would think the same could apply to America when it comes to companies controlling the government, because as far as I know, American businesses have very big lobbying power in their government. So wouldn't it just be the difference in values towards people, since Americans, they value liberty, right? While
Yes.
we value our security and our safety. If does it really matter if I'm not saying to everyone, but it doesn't really matter if like we cannot say whatever we want, as long as we are safe and that there's nothing really shady going on. So back to my main point, is it really just between the difference in values rather than just big companies trying to control, since if there's a big business, there's always going to be big lobbying as well.
That's right. Yeah, I agree with you that what happened in the US is that actually the same, but the only difference is that the US regulate that. In Southeast Asia, we don't have that kind of regulation. That's why big businesses are too powerful, because we don't have a strict regulation how far big businesses can go to control the politics. While in the US, yes, they have a very powerful, but they try to regulate that in terms of, like, for example, lobby group in the US, it's controlled by the law, but we don't have that in Southeast Asia. We don't have the name of lobbying, lobby group, for example, or group lobby. We don't have that one. But in the US, yes, they have, and they have to register it in the parliament, in the Congress. So they have, if they break the law, and they will be dismissed. So, but still the same. They try to lobby the policy, but yeah, the difference only how to regulate. And it's very difficult to regulate in Southeast Asia because the rule of big companies is already too powerful. You can't regulate something is too powerful, right? It's a backlash. If you want to intervene that, they will intervene back. And so that's what happened in the US. But yeah, we still have a long way to go, because we just having a recently really democracy in our region. Thank you for the good question.
Thank you.
Yes,
Well.
you want to say something?
No more. Thank you.
All right, thank you.
Okay, thank you for Mr. Faris and Harvey. And we are now for the second session of Q&A session. The first question from Princess Mary. You can start.
Hello, I am Princess Marie Tomorrow from Central Mindanao University. First, I'd like to
Hello,
say
Mary.
thank you so much for your talk. We learned a lot from you, sir, that would become very beneficial in our field. So we have tackled about the economic development in ASEAN countries such as Indonesia, Singapore, and Philippines. However, we can't deny the fact that political and economic disparities are still persisting and is still evident in our region. There's this book entitled Comparative Politics by McCormick. He stated there that there are two indeed reasons for this disparity. Number one is the vicious circle theory, which states that poverty perpetuates itself. And then the other one is the dependency theory. He stated there that poorer countries are limited to progress because of the unequal international system that is present. So with that being said, does these scenarios also reflect ASEAN's current economic trends, given the fact that there are evident political and economic disparities present still in the region? Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. Should I call you Princess or Mary?
Princess is fine po.
Okay,
Thank you.
it's a nice name. Thank you, Princess. It's a good question. You explained about the book that yes, there are two. I think it's an argument that believed by many scholars. First, because we have a comparative, many South developing countries, because we are located in the south part of the world, and we are really, having a industries like agriculture, natural resources, not advanced in technology. And the second, we are depends more on towards the developed economies, right? Is that yeah, okay. So you asked the question whether it's applied to our region in Southeast Asia. So yes, okay. First, that there are different argument on this. My argument is part of really not 100% agree with the book, because my opinion, because I come from the political economist background, I really believe that that's actually caused by the economic competition within the region, within the country. The number of inequality is not really that we are really depend on agriculture, for example, because developed countries are on technology like Japan, in Asia, not to mention the European and America, because there are examples that countries rely on natural resources can be rich and can be decrease the inequality. An example of Australia. Australia doesn't have I live in Australia for 4 years, so I observed that they don't have advanced technology. They import the technology, and they really rely on natural resource agriculture. So they can be rich and they can be reduce the inequality. So that's number one. Number two, depending on big developed countries, it's possibly, but I think not big. That's not the only reason or the main reason of a large number of people low income in many Southeast Asian countries. It's actually because of the competition of economy within particular country and try to take an advantage. Best example of this in 3 countries: Thailand, Philippines, and Indonesia. Indonesia and the Philippines have a lot of similarities in this. For example, in Indonesia, we've seen that in 1980s, the inequality is not that big, but because of the competition of economy, really the winner were the businesses that close to the government. The government helped them to increase their economy, and the government didn't do the distribution well, and then it caused the large number of inequality. That's why our Gini index, even though in Indonesia now the Gini index that's measured the inequality slightly decreased, but it doesn't mean that compared to 1970s until today, the number being decreased overall, but the number still increased. Why? Because the small number of businesses, rich people are gaining more benefits, and their economy, their wealth are increased very fast because of the competition, and they win that competition because of the help of the political alliance. And that's also applied to Thailand and to the Philippines. So that's why, in my opinion, in some ways, the argument of the book could be true, but it's not entirely explain the case of some countries, because in some countries we've seen that small number of rich people are really controlling economy. Even less than 10% of Indonesian rich people control 80% of the wealth in the country, and that's also happened in the Thailand and the Philippines. I hope it's explained what's your concern.
Thank you so much for answering, sir.
Okay, thank you for the question from Princess and the answer from Mr. Faris. And We go to the next question from Tristan. Tristan, can you hear me? Okay, next from Milky.
Good morning, everyone. Good morning, sir. I am
Morning,
Milky, and I am from Central Mindanao University. So, as what we've discussed earlier in the three case studies presented, specifically in Indonesia, um, big business sectors, corporations, and conglomerates work and tapped with various sectors to advance themselves to progress and really integrate themselves in the global economy or in the global markets. And one of these sectors being tapped by these big business corporations is the governmental sector, in which these corporations relied and sought for protection from the government, which paved the way for their domination in the global markets, as being exemplified in the context of Indomie, for example, wherein this corporation sought for governmental protection, and it allowed that reliance on governmental protection to propel itself in the global markets. So I just want to clarify if this close relationship between big business sectors and the government normal in a capitalist driven economy, or does this present a blatant exemplification of a crony capitalism in which this phenomenon limits and hinders small enterprises or small businesses to enter and participate in the market? Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Milky. It's a really interesting question. Yeah, there are questions that have been asked whether this kind of phenomena is normal, right? Or it's actually represent the chronic capitalism that limited the competition among economic actors. Yeah, I believe the second point is that, yeah, this is part of the chronic capitalism, which actually, if we look back to the basic idea of capitalism, which actually allows the a free competition among economic actors. But we didn't have that example in any other countries. Even in the US, we don't have the free competition. So what we've seen is that the inequality of competition, because economy activities have not been done through a free and fair economic activities, but through unfair activities. The unfair ways is that to have a protection from the government or close alliance with the political elites. And that's happened in many countries, not just in Southeast Asia, even in Latin America, even in European countries as well. But in Southeast Asia is unique because the experience of our region are slightly different compared to any other countries in any region. That's why what happened in our region is that, yes, first, the strong alliance of big capitalists, big businesses. Second, that alliance protect them from the law. One example is in the Philippines, when the expansion of Indonesian Salim Group expansion to the Philippines, now the head of the companies in the Philippines that belong to Indonesian companies is Mr. Manuel Palinginan. Sorry if I mistakenly mentioned the name, but Salim acquired PLDT, the largest telecommunication company, and then the railways companies and many hospitals as well. In 2014, the government broke the law and brought to the court. And according to the court decision, the company should be dismissed from the project and paid the penalty. But what happened? The court couldn't push or couldn't make the company oblige to the decision of the law. Why? Because the closeness of the Salims with the government. How it linked? First, one or two of the commissioners of the company appointed from the former Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the Philippines, and even close to the family of it's not one of the largest conglomerates in the Philippines. I'm not sure whether the Marcos family or the president. Who's the former president of the Philippines?
It's Rodrigo Roa Duterte, sir.
Ah, I see. Yes, there's a link. So I tracked at the time the link. So one or two former ministers that appointed by the Salim to be one of the commissioners. It helped connecting how the government when being punished by the court, and that it didn't happen at the time. So yes, it dismissed the free competition among companies, especially the small and medium enterprises. So that's why there was a joke in many political economies that if you want to be rich, if you're a businessman, if you want to be rich, don't play economy, play politics, because you're playing economy, it cannot make your company bigger. But if you play politics, it's easy to make your company bigger. So yeah, that's a joke for many political economists. Yes, I hope I answered your questions, Milky.
Okay, Mr. Faris, I think this is the last question from Tristan.
Yes.
Tristan, you can start now.
Okay, good afternoon, good morning, everyone. So can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So I have two questions. My first question is, what are the main political ideologies prevalent in Indonesia, and how do they shape the country's political landscape? And
Excuse me,
then
Tristan.
my
Would you
second
mind
question,
would you mind to mention again the first question? Sorry.
sorry. My first question is, what are the main political ideologies prevalent in Indonesia, and how do they shape the country's political landscape?
Okay, yeah.
Then my second question is, how does Indonesia navigate its relations with major global powers like the United States and China? That's all. Thank you.
Right, it's a really good question. First, about the ideology of political ideology in Indonesia and how navigating to major powers, right? Thank you, Tristan. First, yeah, it's really hard to conclude what political ideology of Indonesia, because we previously have liberal, we previously have socialist, and even communist, and even religious ideology. But if you ask now, for example, like in the last 10 to 20 years, what's really ideology? What we've seen at the front or on the table is, yes, it's democracy. Liberal democracy is obvious, the ideology on the table. But under the table, you've seen a really how we mentioned I forgot the term, but it's really where the power goes and political party go. So, for example, I couldn't get the name, but this is the example. If there are two candidates, A and B, the candidate A is likely to win the election, and most political parties will go to the candidate A without any political ideology consideration. So I don't know how to name that. But if it's 50-50, yes, they will go to both of them. But like, for example, during the presidential election in 2014 and 2019, President Joko Widodo is likely to win the election even months before the election. So most of political parties at the time went to support Joko Widodo. Even if we look at the details of the political ideology of the political parties are different, but they still support him because he's likely to win the election. So it's really not based on the political ideology, even though it's a mix between religious political ideology, a liberal political ideology, or even socialist political ideology. It can be in the same boat because of who's going to win the election. So it's really that's what happened in Indonesia. And I believe this also happened in the Philippines. So the combination, the difference between ideology among political parties are not really, even there are surveys that's conducted by surveys poll that's the line between ideologies of political parties in Indonesia are really not that obvious, because they can move to different political parties. The second the second fact in terms of this ideology is that the move of elites, for example, if one leaders in one political party, they retired, they can move to different political parties, become an elite to different political parties. So it shows that it's really not strict or clear line between ideologies. And how Indonesian government navigate? Yes, Indonesia now become considered by many scholars as a one of middle powers, together with Australia, together with South Korea, Japan, which having a member of G20 and play an important role. And Indonesia, first, yes, if I look at to the statement of the government, the priority of foreign ministers, that they really try to play a big role in a global forum. And second, but really not to side with one or two major power like the US or China, even though now Indonesia close to China, close to the US, because the ideology of foreign policy of Indonesia is that to have no alliance with major power, but to be friends with all major powers. Thank you. Okay. Tristan, sorry. I hope I get your questions.
Okay, thank you, Tristan, for the last question. I think we are going to end this meeting. Thank you so much for Mr. Faris for the explanation and for the enthusiasm for all the participants and the questions. And before I end this session, we need to take a picture. And I need to all of you to open your camera so we take a picture.
I would like to say thank you very much for everyone for attending the session. It's a really good opportunity.
Thank you, Mr. Faris. Okay, I need all the participants to open the camera for all 2 slides. Okay, on my mark, everyone smile. 3, 2, 1. Okay, next slide. 3, 2, 1. Okay, thank you everyone, and thank you Mr. Faris for today's sessions. And don't forget to all the participants, we will continue at 12:30. And I will end this meeting by end this Zoom meeting. Thank you for Mr. Faris once again. Thank you, sir.
Bye-bye, everyone.